Welcome back to Video at the Ville. I'm Professor Greenewalt, and this is Congress and Lawmaking. We have a few presentations left to tackle, and one of them is about the Congress and organized interests. So let's take a look at that. We'll also be looking at Congress and the courts. We'll also be looking at Congress and the bureaucracy, among others. But let's take a look at Congress and organized interests for a minute. Much of this is review for those of you who've had me, for example, for state and local government, and we've gone over interest groups before. Let's just do a quick review. What are interest groups? Well, interest groups have a number of elements to them. There are 5 elements that constitute an interest group. They are what? They're a collection of individuals, right? The collection of individuals are organized. Collection of individuals, they're organized. Number 3, the organized individuals share some common view. They all believe in something, and they share that belief. Number 4, they want to advance that view within society or seek recognition for that view within society. So they seek recognition and advancement of their viewpoint in society. And 5th and finally, they engage in repeated and patterned activity, and that's important to note. Repeated and patterned activity to advance their claims in society. So these organized individuals who share a common viewpoint and want to advance that will act together in society and in state legislatures and ultimately, of course, in Congress to advance their view. Well, what are the functions of interest groups? Interest groups' main function would be interest articulation. Interest articulation, they want to set forth, to promote a certain point of view within society and within government, within the Congress. So this is interest articulation is their most important function. But they also do 2 other things. For example, interest groups will also increase political participation. And I like to tell the story in Michigan when I was teaching at Lake Superior State University. When I was the advisor to the ski club, we received all kinds of mail, and one letter was from the Michigan Snowmobile Association. I gave it to the members, but they said, well, we may be interested in alpine sports, but only in skiing, not in snowmobiling. The letter said that one of the legislators in Michigan, one of the state legislators, had set forth a bill to ban snowmobilers from all state parks. So the snowmobilers organized, and when I was watching the news, at the 6 o'clock news on television about state matters, about 3 weeks later, there was a report from Lansing, Michigan. That morning, about 10 buses had pulled up in back of the state capitol, and out flowed a flood of snowmobilers, a tide of snowmobilers that were organized by the Snowmobile Association, and they went through the state capitol and lobbied to defeat that bill. Now, if it hadn't been for the Michigan Snowmobile Association, do you even think that the snowmobilers would have known about the bill, or that they would have gone to Lansing on their own to lobby against it? Probably not. So interest groups can increase political participation. Thirdly and finally, they supplement our official representation. We may be big supporters of migratory waterfowl, and we may go and we may talk to Congressman Schmucker about that, and he may agree. But Congressman Schmucker, while he's in Washington, D.C., or our state senators or state reps while they're in Harrisburg, they may agree with protecting migratory waterfowl, but they have many, many other bills to consider and interests to deal with as well, not just one. But we may be quite committed to this cause, so what should we do? Well, we should join Ducks Unlimited or the Audubon Society, because what will those organizations do? They will supplement our official representation. They'll work in Harrisburg, they'll work in Washington, D.C. to do the same thing that we'd hope that Congressman Schmucker will do, and maybe he will. But these two organizations will supplement our official representation in Washington on this issue. Well, as we look at interest groups in America, we find that America has more interest groups than any other country in the world. And the interest groups are formed and dissolved every hour of the day. There's some interest group that's going out of business and another one that's being formed. Why do we have so many interest groups in the United States? Well, one is we have great social diversity, and as our interest groups grow up to or are formed to represent the various interests of different people, you will find there will be an interest group that will represent the causes of Israel, one that will represent the causes of, for example, the Taiwan, one that will represent the interests of Japan, and so on and so forth. It's interesting if you get off of Route 81 when you're going north between Fort Indiantown Gap and Scranton, get off at Mount Carmel. It's about halfway to Scranton, and you can see Mount Carmel from Route 81. It's on the west side of the highway. And you go up and down the main street of Mount Carmel, very tiny town, but right along Main Street you have the different buildings there which house the different interest groups in Mount Carmel for Germans, the German Society, for Lithuanians, for Italians, and for Poles. There are 4 different buildings on the main street of Mount Carmel that house those interest groups. This is an example of the social diversity that we see, at least in northeastern Pennsylvania. Well, we have more interest groups than any other country in the world as well, not just because of our social diversity, but because of, as some of my political science friends will term it or coin it, governmental fragmentation. Government fragmentation, of course, is just federalism, and that an interest group to succeed in America will not just have to represent its case in Washington, D.C., but in many instances they will have to lobby in the state capitals as well, and in the largest of the local governments if it's a local problem as well. Lastly, you find that we have more interest groups because there seems to be a correlation between the strength and health of political parties and the strength and health of interest groups. When political parties are strong, interest groups tend to be weak. And when political parties are weak, interest groups tend to be strong. Well, ever since the early 1960s, since before the 1960 presidential election to the current time, our political parties are very weak. Consequently, our interest groups are robust and quite strong. Remember, we used to have political parties that were so strong in our area. You can still find buildings that are owned in Harrisburg and York and Lancaster and Lebanon and Reading by the different parties. There would be a Democrats club and a Republican club, and they may very well have a bowling alley downstairs. They would have a large ballroom for social gatherings, and they would have a restaurant or tavern or bar as well. And almost all of these are still open at the current time. But up until the 1960 election, goodness, you would have winning candidates, winning political parties in our area conduct torchlight parades through the streets of Lancaster, Harrisburg, or Lebanon. Political parties were very important in the life of Americans. Again, up until the 1960s, the most important institutions in American life were what? They were our family, our church, our elementary school, and our political party. And almost all social lives relatives of families were organized around those institutions. Well, we find that interest groups also attract criticism. What are the criticisms that we find of interest groups? Number one, and please follow along on your PowerPoints, which I've sent you separately, and you can follow those on your electronic devices, or if you have you printed them and you have them by your side, that's great. Well, you find the first criticism of interest groups in the United States is that all interests are not represented equally. And I say to that, fiddlesticks. All interests aren't equal, so it doesn't matter that all interests are not represented equally. I mean, goodness, we have still have in America Flat Earth Society. You think the interests of the Flat Earth Society are equivalent to the interests of a group that's seeking to solve the problems of Alzheimer's or of homelessness or creating a robust economy or better schools? Hardly, I think. So I'm not very much driven by the criticism that all interests are not represented equally. They never will be. Second criticism of interest groups is that all interest groups tend to be dominated by an active minority. Yes, that's probably true. They're dominated by the people who form them and the people who run them, without a doubt. That's hard to get around that. And thirdly, interest groups have limited accountability, and that's true as well. They have accountability mostly to their board, and their board members are chosen by the people who form them. They do have limited accountability, no doubt. Well, the types of interest groups. America has two types of interest groups. Find that we have public interest groups and we have special interest groups. Public interest groups are interest groups that represent interests that everyone can agree on, or everyone can have a stake in or share in society. Public interest groups represent interests that affect all of us. The membership is open to everyone, and it's affordable. So these examples of these types of groups would be Common Cause, which they are interested in what? Good government. You have groups such as Public Citizen, again another good government group of Ralph Nader. You have the Sierra Club, you have Greenpeace, that are environmental groups, that are examples of public groups. But then we also have special interest groups. Special interest groups represent the interests of particular professions or particular economic groups. The membership is not open to everyone, it's only open to the members of that group, and the fees are very expensive. Examples of this would be the American Medical Association. They're only open to doctors. The American Nurses Association, only open to nurses. The National Education Association, only open to teachers. You find that if you are a doctor, for example, in Pennsylvania, you have to belong to the American Medical Association because that's how you stay up to date on all the current activities that are going on, the current developments in your field. And we find that whereas my brother, when he was in college, might have been able to join Greenpeace for $15, that if you're a doctor today and you want to join the American Medical Association, it's more along the lines, it's thousands of dollars, something like 10,000 or up. Those are estimates, but in that range. So they're very different, special interest groups and public interest groups. Now, interest groups have tactics. How do they try to promote their point of view? Well, they try to promote their point of view by doing 5 things. One, by engaging in mass propaganda. When one of their interests is being considered by the Congress, they will take out full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal, full-page ads in USA Today. They'll take radio ads on some of the radio stations that might be the largest ones dealing with radio talk show programs or on the PBS stations. But mass propaganda, in one form or another, they take out magazine articles, and of course, mass propaganda will also now, in this day and age, go on in social media. Well, secondly, interest groups can engage in litigation. They can file lawsuits to try to promote their point of view in society. Number three, they can use grassroots pressure. Now, what is grassroots pressure? Grassroots pressure is nothing more than using your membership, not your paid professional lobbyists, but galvanizing your membership to get out and meet their congressmen, their senators personally, going to their home district offices. Political campaign activities is the fourth activity or tactic that interest groups can use to promote their point of view. You find a political campaign activity would be giving campaign contributions and trying to get out the vote for their friends in the Congress, and to do just the opposite for their opponents in Congress. Fifthly and finally, interest groups can also try to affect legislation and the developments in Congress through the utilization of lobbyists, professional lobbyists. These are people who are hired by the organizations, and if the organization is large and has many bills under consideration throughout most of the congressional session, they'll have full-time professional lobbyists. Some groups, for example, the Philadelphia Phillies, they don't need a full-time lobbyist in Washington or Harrisburg, so they engage the services of what are called contract lobbyists. These are individuals, many of them lawyers, who work for lobby firms, law firms, in the capital or a state capital, and they only, their services are only rendered to the interest group when a bill that interests them is being considered. So that might be just once every 2 or 3 years, and they just lobby for a certain period of time until that bill is decided, and then they go back into a state of hibernation, if you will. How can we differentiate the interest groups? Which are powerful and which aren't? And what determines the power of an interest group? Well, number one would be, of course, the size of the membership. What's the largest interest group in America? Well, they own a full block in Washington, D.C. And once you guys start to approach your 40th birthday, you'll get lots of literature from them in the mail that will continue for the rest of your life. And it's the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. The AARP is the largest interest group in America. So the size of the membership can add clout to the interest group. How much money the interest group has, and if they're willing to spend it. Here in Pennsylvania, of course, the most powerful interest group is the Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers Association. And they are the most powerful group because they have lots of money and they're willing to use it. So money matters. Number three would be the prestige of a group. The American Medical Association, the Pennsylvania Medical Society, they have a great deal of prestige. They're doctors. On the other hand, you have, excuse me, you have the Roto-Rooter Association. They don't have as much prestige. Roto-Rooters don't have as much status as doctors do. So the American Medical Society would have more clout than the National Roto-Rooters Association would. Number four, the quality of information that your group provides to legislators. If you are providing them with timely information and accurate and useful information, that's going to be very helpful in convincing legislators to vote your way. Fifthly, fifthly, opportunities for non-government employment, find that sometime congressmen or U.S. senators, they're not going to work in the Congress their whole life. Some of them want to do something different. Some of them will lose an election. So if there's an opportunity and they know it to work for that interest group after they would no longer be in Congress, they might be more favorably inclined to support that group. There was a state senator, Senator Wayne Ewing from Pittsburgh, who worked in the Pennsylvania Senate. He's a great guy, and he lost a primary election after I just had arrived in Harrisburg. But he was picked up. He was hired by the Pennsylvania Gas Association, and he had had a good relationship with them previously. He had voted their way many times, and when he lost an election, they were there to offer him a job. Sixthly and finally, the last factor that determines how powerful your interest group is going to be would be the intensity of your interest group opinions. How intense does your membership feel about their issue? Certainly there's one interest group that stands out in regard to this. One interest group whose members, it's not the biggest interest group, it's not the wealthiest interest group, but they by far listen, they respond to the calls of their leadership maybe better than any other interest group. When they are asked to write, they write. When they're asked to email, they email. When they're asked to visit, they visit. And of course, I'm talking about the National Rifle Association. The NRA is by far the interest group whose members have the strongest opinions. Okay, well, this takes us up to interest group formation. We're almost at the end of this particular this topic. There are three different theories on why interest groups are formed. And you find them in your textbook. One is the proliferation hypothesis. The proliferation hypothesis simply tells us that as society becomes more complicated, more sophisticated, that groups form to reflect the issues of the day and the interests of the different groups of people around the nation. The second hypothesis we have is the disturbance hypothesis. And this simply states that interest groups will form, interest groups will organize themselves when the existing order is disturbed, when specific interests are helped or hurt. And the third theory about interest group formation is called the exchange hypothesis. And the exchange hypothesis simply says that groups form because of entrepreneurial-minded individuals, people that are willing to put forth the effort to organize themselves and others of like mind to represent their issues, and they hope to offer a whole set of benefits to their interest group members then. So the exchange hypothesis, I'll go ahead and I'll support your viewpoint, and in return I can buy auto insurance, home insurance, life insurance from your association as one of your members at a much reduced rate. Well, what are the ways that interest groups go about lobbying? Now again, your textbook talks about 5 ways that they go about lobbying, and they make sense. Direct lobbying, here you have the lobbyist of the group meeting with the legislator, presenting their arguments directly to the legislators and the staff. Then we have social lobbying. Social lobbying is when the lobbyist will run into the congressmen or the senators at one of the fundraisers that go on every night in Washington, D.C., or at a party, and they will talk to them about issues at that point. And thirdly, we have coalition lobbying. Coalition lobbying is when lobbyists cobble together, they construct coalitions of different interest groups that will work together to support specific legislative initiatives, coalition lobbying. We have grassroots lobbying, which I mentioned before. That's when the organization will ask its members to go out by themselves to meet with senators and representatives who serve in Washington, D.C. Lastly, there's electronic lobbying. Electronic lobbying is just a reflection of the day and age of social media. When your membership goes on to Twitter and goes on to Facebook, and they put forth the arguments for your viewpoint and why Congress should consider them. Well, Congress has tried over the years, particularly since the Second World War, to get a handle on interest groups, to try to regulate interest groups, if you will, and make sure that everything's above board. And three things I want you to take a look at, and they're discussed extensively in your textbook on Congress and its members by Davidson. Number one is the 1946 lobbying law. What did that do? What were the strengths of it? What were the weaknesses of it? I want you to look at the Lobby Disclosure Act of 1995. Same thing. What did it do? What were the strengths? What were the weaknesses? And finally, in the year 2007, we have the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. The Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007. You want to take a look at what all three of these measures did and their strengths and weaknesses. Lastly, the book also has a picture for us, a diagram of the types of interest groups that are registered to lobby in the United States and in our Congress. When you look at all the types of interest groups registered to lobby, 41% of them are businesses, 22% of them are trade associations, 14% of them are citizens groups, 9% are professional associations, 12% are other groups, and 2% are unions. So this is how the breakdown occurs among different groups and who hope to lobby in the Congress of the United States. So all of that can be found in your textbook, and I want you to take a look at that, please. All right, if you have any questions about Congress and organized interests, please give me a call. I'll be happy to try to answer them and talk about the subject with you. Okay, I'll see you at video at the Ville on another topic, and when you're ready. See you then.